If I take your charger, I might change your life, the stranger said with a quiet urgency that made Lily Monroe hesitate for a single breath too long as the low battery warning blinked across her own phone screen. The small red icon pulsing like a countdown she could not afford to ignore while the late afternoon crowd moved around them inside a crowded Manhattan coffee shop. The smell of burnt espresso hanging in the air and the hum of conversations blending into a restless city rhythm that never seemed to pause for anyone, especially not for someone like her who was waiting on an email that could decide whether she would finally escape the cycle of overdue rent notices and secondhand coats. Yet something in his voice, steady but strained, made her look up and really see him, not just a stranger, but a man on the edge of something important, his phone already dimming, his jaw tight, his eyes carrying a kind of pressure she recognized, because she lived with it every single day, and before she could talk herself out of it, she pulled the charger from her bag and placed it in his hand, saying softly that he looked like he needed it more than she did, even as her own screen flickered again, warning her that whatever message she had been waiting for might disappear before she ever saw it. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you cannot miss. The man blinked, surprised, as if kindness had caught him off guard. And for a moment he did not move, just stared at the charger resting in his palm like it meant more than a simple cable ever should. Then he nodded once, a silent thank you, and stepped away to answer a call that came through just in time, his voice shifting instantly from quiet desperation to sharp authority as he spoke into the phone in low, controlled tones that did not match the worn jacket he was wearing, while Lily stood there watching the battery percentage on her own phone drop lower and lower, each second stretching longer than the last. The email she had been waiting for still not arriving, or maybe arriving and slipping away without her ever knowing, and when her screen finally went black, she felt that familiar hollow feeling settle in her chest, the one that came whenever life asked her to choose between survival and kindness, and she chose kindness anyway, not because it was easy, but because somewhere deep down she refused to become the kind of person who walked away even when walking away would have made everything simpler. And across the room, the stranger ended his call and glanced back at her, his expression unreadable, as if he had just made a decision that involved her. Even though she had no idea yet that this small moment, this single act, would ripple far beyond a dead phone and a missed message into something she never could have planned, never could have applied for, and never could have imagined. The moment the man disappeared into the flow of people and glass doors, Lily Monroe stood alone beside the small round table, her fingers still curled as if she were holding on to something that was no longer there. And for a few seconds she did not move at all, just stared at her phone as if willing it to come back to life. But the screen stayed dark, reflecting only a faint outline of her tired face and the overhead lights flickering softly above, and slowly the weight of what she had done settled in, not as regret exactly, but as a quiet realization that whatever opportunity had been waiting for her on that screen was now gone, slipped past her in silence without even a notification she could read, and the thought hit harder than she expected because that email had not just been another message. It had been the result of weeks of applications, late nights rewriting her resume, and walking miles across the city to drop off printed copies at offices that barely looked at her twice. And now all of that effort felt like it had vanished in the span of a single decision that lasted less than 10 seconds. And she let out a small breath, steadying herself the way she always did when things fell apart, telling herself that this was not the end, that there would be another chance, even if she had no idea where it would come from. Then she gathered her bag and stepped out into the early evening air where the city carried on as if nothing had happened. Cars honking, people rushing, lights beginning to glow in the windows of tall buildings that seemed so far removed from her world, and she walked 3 blocks to the subway station, her shoes worn thin against the concrete, the chill in the air slipping through the fabric of her coat as she descended the stairs into the underground where the smell of metal and electricity filled the space. And as she waited on the platform, she caught herself glancing at every passing face, half expecting to see the stranger again, not because she needed anything from him, but because there had been something unfinished in the way he looked at her, something that did not feel like a simple exchange between two people who would never meet again. But the train arrived, and the doors opened, and the moment passed, and she stepped inside, gripping the pole as the car lurched forward, her reflection faint in the window beside her, eyes distant, mind already shifting to practical worries like rent that was due in 3 days and a message from her landlord that had grown more impatient with each passing week. And by the time she reached her stop, the sky above had turned a deep shade of blue, the kind that made the city lights feel brighter and colder at the same time. And her apartment building stood exactly as she left it, narrow, aging, the hallway dim and quiet as she climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor and pushed open the door to her small room where everything she owned fit into a space barely larger than a parking spot. A single bed, a chipped desk, a narrow closet with clothes she rotated carefully to make them last longer than they should, and she set her bag down and sat on the edge of the bed, finally allowing herself to feel the full weight of the day, the missed email, the uncertainty, the constant balancing act between hope and reality. And for a moment her composure slipped as she pressed her hands together, eyes closing, not in despair, but in determination, because giving up had never been an option she allowed herself to consider. And somewhere across the city, in a glass tower that rose high above the streets, Adrian Cole stood in a private office with floor-to-ceiling windows, the skyline stretching endlessly before him as he replayed the moment in the coffee shop again and again, the way she had not hesitated, the way she had given without asking for anything in return. And on the desk in front of him sat the charger, neatly coiled, out of place among polished wood and expensive devices, and he reached for it slowly, turning it over in his hand as if it carried more weight than it should. Then he pressed a button on the intercom, and his voice, calm but decisive, cut through the quiet room as he gave a simple instruction to his assistant to find her. Not her name, because he did not have it. Not her number, because she had not offered it. But the girl from the coffee shop on Lexington Avenue around 5 in the evening, the one who chose to give something up when she had every reason not to. And when his assistant hesitated, unsure how to even begin, Adrian did not explain further. He only said that sometimes the most important hires were not the ones who applied. And as the line went silent, he looked out over the city once more, the charger still in his hand. And for the first time along, while the decision he had just made did not come from strategy or profit or pressure, but from something far less predictable, something that had begun with a dying phone and a stranger who chose kindness when it cost her something real. Morning arrived quietly, without ceremony, the pale light slipping through the thin curtains of Lily Monroe's small apartment as the distant sound of traffic filtered up from the street below. And for a brief moment she lay still, staring at the ceiling as if trying to gather the pieces of herself before the day began again. But reality did not wait. It pressed forward in the form of a buzzing alarm on her phone that finally powered on after being charged overnight. And the first thing she saw was not opportunity, but absence. No new messages, no missed calls, no second chance waiting in her inbox. Just the same silence that had followed her home the night before. And she exhaled slowly, pushing herself up and swinging her feet onto the cold floor, already bracing for another day of searching, trying, and being overlooked, yet she moved with quiet determination, pulling on a simple blouse and jeans, tying her hair back, and grabbing the worn folder that held printed copies of her resume, each page slightly creased from being carried across the city again and again. And within 30 minutes she was outside, walking past rows of storefronts just opening for the day, the smell of fresh bagels drifting through the air, the city stretching awake around her as she made her way toward a row of office buildings where she had planned to try her luck again. Even though she knew how it usually went, polite smiles, quick glances, promises to keep her information on file that never turned into anything real. And still she showed up because showing up was the only thing she could control, and by mid-morning she had already been turned away twice, once by a receptionist who barely looked up, and once by a hiring manager who said they were not taking walk-ins. And with each rejection, she felt the quiet pressure building again. Not panic, not yet, but something heavier, something closer to the realization that time was not on her side. And by early afternoon, she found herself sitting on a bench near a busy intersection, her folder resting in her lap as she stared ahead without really seeing anything, her thoughts drifting to the charger she had given away, not as regret, but as a question she could not quite answer. Had it mattered? Had it changed anything at all? Or had it simply been one more small sacrifice in a long list of sacrifices that never seemed to lead anywhere? And she shook her head slightly as if to push the thought away, because dwelling on it would not help her move forward. And just as she was about to stand and continue walking, her phone vibrated in her hand, the sudden sound sharp against the noise of the city. And for a split second she froze, her heart lifting in cautious hope as she looked down at the screen. An unfamiliar number, no name, no company, just a call she had not expected. And she hesitated, then answered, her voice steady despite the uncertainty. Hello? And on the other end, a calm professional voice introduced herself as calling from Cole Group headquarters, asking if she was Lily Monroe. And when Lily confirmed, there was a brief pause, as if the caller was verifying something important before continuing with words that did not immediately make sense. They said they would like to invite her for an interview for a position within their organization. And Lily blinked, her brow furrowing as confusion replaced the flicker of hope, because she had never applied to Cole Group. Not online, not in person, not at any job fair she could remember. And she said as much, apologetically at first, assuming there had been a mistake, but the voice on the other end remained calm, reassuring her that there was no mistake, that her name had been specifically requested, and that they believed she would be a strong candidate. And the words hung in the air between them, strange and unreal, like something that belonged to someone else's life, not hers. And for a moment she considered saying no, because uncertainty felt safer than disappointment. But something inside her, the same quiet instinct that had made her hand over that charger, pushed her to say yes, to accept the interview, to at least see what waited on the other side of this unexpected door. And as the call ended, she sat there for a few seconds longer, the city moving around her, her reflection faint in the dark screen of her phone. And she could not shake the feeling that whatever had just begun was connected to something she did not yet understand. Something that started in a crowded coffee shop with a stranger who had looked at her like her choice mattered more. And she realized the address they gave her did not feel real until she stood in front of it. A towering glass building that stretched high into the Manhattan skyline, its polished surface reflecting the morning light in sharp, almost blinding angles. And Lily Monroe paused at the edge of the sidewalk, her fingers tightening slightly around the strap of her bag as people in tailored suits moved past her with purpose, their pace confident, their expressions focused in a way that made her feel like she had stepped into a world that operated on a completely different rhythm. And for a brief moment doubt crept in, quiet but persistent, whispering that this had to be a mistake, that someone like her did not get called into places like this without a reason she could clearly explain. Yet the memory of the voice on the phone remained steady in her mind, certain, deliberate, and she took a slow breath before stepping forward, crossing the threshold into the building where the air shifted instantly, cooler, cleaner, carrying the faint scent of polished marble and something subtle she could not quite place. And the lobby opened wide before her. High ceilings, soft lighting, a front desk where a receptionist greeted visitors with practiced ease, and Lily approached carefully, giving her name, half expecting confusion or hesitation. But instead the receptionist smiled politely and nodded as if Lily had been expected all along, directing her to a private elevator that required a key card to access. And when the doors closed behind her, she caught her reflection again in the mirrored walls, adjusting her sleeves slightly, her posture straightening as she tried to match the confidence of the people she had seen outside, even if she did not feel it yet. And the elevator moved smoothly upward, each passing floor bringing a quiet tension that settled in her chest. Not fear exactly, but anticipation mixed with uncertainty. And when the doors opened, she stepped into a quiet hallway lined with glass offices and soft carpeting that muted every footstep. The atmosphere calm, but charged with something unspoken, and a woman in a fitted suit greeted her almost immediately, introducing herself as part of the hiring team and guiding Lily toward a conference room at the end of the hall. And as they walked, Lily noticed the subtle details, the way conversations behind glass walls were measured and controlled, the way every movement seemed intentional, and it made her acutely aware of her own presence there, like she was stepping into a role she had not rehearsed for. Yet she kept moving, because turning back was no longer an option, and when they reached the room, the woman gestured for her to enter, offering a reassuring smile before closing the door behind her, leaving Lily alone in a space that felt both open and isolating at the same time. A long table, a few chairs, a screen mounted on the wall, and she took a seat, placing her folder neatly in front of her as she waited, her mind racing through possibilities, trying to understand why she had been brought here, what they expected from her, and most of all, what she was supposed to say when they asked the question she could not yet answer. Why are you here? And the seconds stretched longer than they should, each one sharpening her awareness of every small sound, the faint hum of the building, the distant murmur of voices outside, until finally the door opened again and two people stepped inside, their expressions professional, composed, and they greeted her with polite introductions before taking their seats across from her, and without any small talk or casual easing into the conversation. One of them leaned forward slightly and asked the first question in a tone that was calm but direct, not about her experience or her skills, but something entirely different, something that caught her off guard in a way no standard interview ever had. They asked her to describe the last time she chose to help someone when it cost her something important, and for a moment Lily simply looked at them, the question echoing in her mind because it was too specific, too close to what had just happened. And as she opened her mouth to respond, she felt that strange connection again, the sense that this moment, this place, and that small decision in a crowded coffee shop were somehow part of the same unfolding story, one she had not planned, one she did not fully understand yet, but one she was already standing in the middle of. For a moment, Lily Monroe said nothing, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the table as she searched for the right words. Not because she did not have an answer, but because the truth felt strangely vulnerable in a room that seemed designed for polished responses and rehearsed confidence. Yet the question did not feel like it was asking for perfection. It felt like it was asking for honesty. And so she took a small breath and spoke, telling them about the coffee shop, about the stranger, whose phone was dying, about the email she had been waiting for, and how she knew what she might lose by giving up her charger. And as she spoke, her voice remained steady, not defensive, not trying to impress, simply explaining the moment as it had happened, the choice she made without knowing the outcome. And when she finished, the room fell quiet for a few seconds, the two interviewers exchanging a brief glance that she could not fully read, as if confirming something unspoken between them, before one of them leaned back slightly and asked another question, this time about what she believed mattered more, opportunity or integrity. And again, Lily did not rush her answer. She thought about it, about the past few months of her life, about every small decision that had led her to this room. And she said that opportunity could change your situation, but integrity defined who you became when no one was watching. And this time the silence that followed felt different, less like evaluation and more like consideration, as if her words had landed exactly where they needed to. And the questions continued, not about technical skills or past job titles, but about choices, values, moments where she had to decide between what was easy and what was right. And with each answer, Lily felt a shift inside herself, the initial uncertainty slowly giving way to a quiet confidence, not because she suddenly felt qualified for whatever this role might be, but because she realized that for once she was not being measured against something she lacked. She was being seen for something she already had. And when the interview finally came to a pause, one of the interviewers closed their notebook and offered her a small, thoughtful smile, thanking her for her time and telling her that someone else would be joining shortly. And as they stood and left the room, Lily felt that familiar tension return, sharper now because she had no idea what came next. And the seconds stretched again until the door opened once more. But this time there was only one person who stepped inside. And the moment she saw him, her breath caught, not dramatically, not in a way anyone else might notice, but enough that she felt it, because standing there in a tailored suit that fit him perfectly, his presence calm and controlled in a way that filled the room without effort, was the same man from the coffee shop, the stranger who had taken her charger. And for a brief second the world seemed to narrow around that single realization, the memory of that moment replaying instantly in her mind, the urgency in his voice, the way he had looked at her. And now he looked completely different, not worn or uncertain, but composed, powerful, someone who clearly belonged in a place like this. And he met her gaze with a calm familiarity that confirmed what she was already beginning to understand, that this was not coincidence. And he stepped further into the room, closing the door behind him before speaking her name in a tone that was steady and certain, as if he had known it long before she had spoken it out loud. And in that moment, everything began to connect. The unexpected call, the strange questions, the feeling that this interview had been about something more than qualifications. And Lily felt a mix of confusion and clarity settle in at the same time, because whatever this was, whatever role she had just stepped into without realizing it, it had started the moment she chose to give something up for someone she did not know. And now that same choice was standing in front of her, no longer a stranger, but someone who had clearly been watching, waiting, and deciding what to do next. The silence in the room shifted the moment Adrian Cole stepped closer, not heavy, not uncomfortable, but charged with a quiet certainty that this meeting had been inevitable long before Lily Monroe ever walked through the doors of the building. And for a brief moment, neither of them spoke, just stood there looking at each other, as if acknowledging a shared understanding that did not need to be explained yet. Until Adrian finally broke the silence, his voice calm, measured, and unmistakably the same voice she had heard in the coffee shop. Only now it carried authority instead of urgency. And he said that he had been wondering when they would meet again under different circumstances, and Lily felt a small shift in her chest at the way he said it. Not like a coincidence, but like something planned, and she straightened slightly, her confusion no longer hidden as she asked the question that had been building since the moment he walked in. "How did you know it was me?" And Adrian gave a faint, almost knowing smile before walking toward the table and placing something gently in front of her. And when she looked down, her breath caught again, because it was her charger, neatly coiled, exactly as she had handed it to him. And he said that he had made sure to keep it safe, not because it was valuable, but because the moment attached to it was. And Lily looked back up at him, her thoughts moving quickly now, connecting pieces that had not made sense before, the unexpected call, the specific questions, the way everything seemed designed to lead her here. And she asked him directly if this interview had been arranged because of what happened in the coffee shop. And Adrian did not hesitate. He said yes, but not in the way she might think. And he explained that he had been searching for someone for a role that could not be filled through applications or resumes. Someone who would make the right decision when there was no clear benefit. Someone who would choose integrity even when it came at a personal cost. And when he lost power on his phone that day, it was not just an inconvenience. It was a moment that revealed something he had been trying to find for a long time. And Lily listened, her expression steady, but her mind racing, because part of her understood what he was saying and part of her resisted it, unsure whether to feel seen or tested. And she asked him why he had not just introduced himself, why he had not been honest from the beginning. And Adrian paused for a brief second before answering, saying that if he had told her who he was, her decision might have been different. And he needed to know who she was when there was nothing to gain, and the honesty in that answer settled between them. Not defensive, not manipulative, just direct. And Lily felt the weight of it. Because she knew he was right, the situation would have changed everything. And for a moment she looked down at the charger in front of her, her fingers brushing lightly against it as if grounding herself in something familiar. And when she looked back up, her voice was quieter but firm as she asked what exactly he was offering her. And Adrian stepped back slightly, giving her space as he explained that the position was within a division of his company focused on community development and outreach, a role that required trust, judgment, and the ability to see people beyond their circumstances, and that he believed she had already demonstrated those qualities in a way that no interview could replicate. And the room fell quiet again as his words settled, and Lily felt that familiar tension return, not from uncertainty this time, but from the realization that this opportunity was unlike anything she had expected, not something she had worked toward in a traditional sense, but something that had found her because of a single decision. And she knew in that moment that whatever she said next would not just define whether she accepted the offer. It would define how she saw herself within it, whether she believed she had earned it or whether. She would always question if it had simply been given to her. And as she sat there with the charger between them, the symbol of that moment that had changed everything, she understood that the real decision was not about the job. It was about what she believed her own actions were worth when no one was watching. For a long moment, Lily Monroe did not answer, her eyes resting on the charger between them, as if it held the weight of everything Adrian Cole had just said. And when she finally spoke, her voice was calm but steady, asking him a question that mattered more than the offer itself. She asked how he could be sure that one moment defined who she really was, and Adrian did not seem surprised by that. Instead, he nodded slightly as if he had been waiting for it, and he said that it was not just the action, it was the cost behind it, the fact that she knew what she might lose and still chose to give. And that kind of decision was not something people performed, it was something they revealed. And Lily listened carefully, her expression thoughtful, because part of her understood exactly what he meant, but another part of her still resisted the idea that a single choice could outweigh everything else she had struggled through. And she told him that she had spent months trying to earn opportunities the traditional way, sending applications, showing up, proving herself, and none of that had brought her here, so it felt difficult to accept that one unexpected moment had done what all of her effort could not. And Adrian stepped a little closer, not imposing but present. And he said that effort still mattered, that everything she had done before had shaped the person who made that choice. But the difference was that most systems only measured what could be listed on paper, while he was looking for something that could not be written down, and the room grew quiet again as his words settled, and Lily felt something shift inside her, not complete certainty, but a slow recognition that this was not about replacing her effort. It was about revealing the result of it. And she let out a small breath before asking one more question: what happens if she says yes? And Adrian answered without hesitation. He said that she would start immediately, working directly within a small team that handled real community projects, not as an assistant or observer, but as someone whose decisions would carry real impact, and that she would be expected to learn quickly, adapt constantly, and prove herself through action, not because he doubted her, but because the role demanded it. And Lily nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of that responsibility. Because for the first time, the offer did not feel like something given. It felt like something she would have to rise into. And that realization grounded her in a way she had not expected. And after a moment, she reached forward and picked up the charger, holding it lightly in her hand before looking back at him. And she said that if she accepted this, it would not be because he chose her, it would be because she believed she could do the work. And Adrian's expression shifted slightly, not into a smile, but into something quieter, a kind of respect that did not need to be spoken. And he nodded once, agreeing. And with that, Lily made her decision. She said yes, not with hesitation, but with a calm certainty that surprised even her. And the moment she spoke the word, it felt less like stepping into something unknown and more like stepping forward into something she had been moving toward all along without realizing it. And Adrian acknowledged her answer with a simple nod before turning toward the door, telling her that someone would meet her outside to begin the onboarding process. And as he opened the door, he paused for just a fraction of a second, glancing back at her as if to say something more. But instead he simply said that she should hold on to that charger, because it might remind her why she was there when things became difficult. And then he stepped out, leaving Lily alone once more. But this time the silence felt different, not uncertain, but full, like the beginning of something that had already started to unfold. And as she stood there holding the small cable in her hand, she understood that her life had shifted in a way she could not yet fully see, not because someone had offered her a chance, but because she had chosen who she wanted to be when it mattered. And now she would have to prove that choice again and again in a world that would not make it easy for her to hold on to it. The first day did not begin with a grand welcome or a moment to catch her breath. It began with movement, fast and precise, as Lily Monroe was guided through the upper floors of the building by a woman named Karen who spoke with calm efficiency, explaining schedules, departments, and expectations in a tone that made it clear this was not a place where people eased into responsibility. and Lily followed closely, her senses absorbing everything at once. The quiet hum of focused conversations. Behind glass walls, the steady rhythm of footsteps across polished floors. The subtle shift in how people carried themselves, as if every decision they made held weight beyond the moment. And within minutes, she was introduced to a small team that would be working with her, individuals who greeted her politely, but with a certain distance, their expressions measured, their curiosity restrained, and she could feel it immediately. The unspoken question behind their eyes. Who is she and why is she here? And that question did not need to be voiced for her to understand it, because she would have asked the same thing if their positions were reversed. And Karen handed her a tablet, explaining that her first assignment would begin that morning, not a simulation, not training, but a real project involving a local housing initiative that required immediate attention. And Lily nodded, even as a small wave of pressure moved through her chest, because this was exactly what Adrian had said. Real work, real impact, no time to hide behind preparation. And as the team gathered around a large screen to review the project details, Lily listened carefully, taking in every piece of information, the timelines, the challenges, the community concerns that needed to be addressed. And when Karen asked if anyone had initial thoughts, there was a brief pause before one of the team members spoke, offering a solution that sounded structured and safe, and others nodded in agreement. And then Karen turned to Lily, not with expectation, but with quiet curiosity, asking if she had anything to add. And for a moment, Lily felt the weight of every doubt that had followed her into this room, the knowledge that she was new, that she had not come through the usual path, that every word she spoke would be measured differently. But she also felt something else, the same instinct that had guided her before. And she spoke, not trying to impress, but to be clear, suggesting that before implementing any solution, they needed to spend time understanding the people directly affected, not through reports or summaries, but through conversation, because solutions designed from a distance often missed what mattered most on the ground. And when she finished, there was a brief silence, not dismissive, but considering, and Karen studied her for a moment before nodding slightly, acknowledging the point without immediate judgment. And the meeting moved forward, but Lily could feel the subtle shift in the room, attention turning toward her in a way that was no longer neutral. And as the day continued, she moved through tasks that required focus and adaptability, reviewing documents, observing discussions, asking questions when needed. And each step felt like walking a narrow line between proving herself and simply learning. And by the afternoon, the initial politeness had begun to thin, replaced by small interactions that carried more weight, a colleague asking how she had been selected for the role with a tone that was casual on the surface but probing underneath, another making an offhand remark about how quickly some people seemed to move up without going through the usual process. And Lily did not respond defensively. She simply answered what she could and let the rest pass, because she understood that trust was not given in environments like this. It was built slowly, through consistency, through action, through time. And as the day drew toward its end, she found herself standing by the large windows overlooking the city. The same skyline she had seen from the street now spread out before her from a completely different perspective, and she held the charger in her hand for a moment. The small object grounding her in the reason she was there, not as proof to others, but as a reminder to herself. And she knew that this was only the beginning, that whatever she had stepped into would test her in ways she could not yet predict, and that the hardest part would not be doing the work. It would be holding on to the part of herself that made her worthy of it in the first place. By the second day, the shift was no longer subtle. It was visible in the way conversations paused when Lily Monroe walked into a room, in the way voices lowered just enough to suggest discretion, but not enough to hide intention. And she felt it not as open hostility, but as something quieter and more persistent, a question that lingered in every glance and every measured interaction. And it did not take long before that question found its way into words, because late that afternoon, as the team gathered again to review updates on the housing initiative, one of the senior members, a man named Daniel, leaned back in his chair and asked in a tone that was almost casual, but carried a clear edge beneath it how exactly she had been selected for this role. And the room stilled for a brief moment, not in surprise, but in anticipation, as if everyone had been waiting for someone to say it out loud. And Lily met his gaze calmly, not defensive but aware, and she answered simply that she had been invited after an interview, which was true but not the whole story, and Daniel gave a small nod, as if acknowledging the answer, while also dismissing at the same time, saying that most people there had spent years building their way into the team, and that it was unusual to see someone step in without that background. And there it was, no longer implied, and Lily felt the weight of it settle in the room. But instead of reacting, she held onto the same steady composure she had carried since the beginning, because she understood that this moment was not just about explanation. It was about perception, and perception could not be changed with a single statement. And Karen, who had been observing quietly, redirected the conversation back to the project, but the tension did not disappear. It simply shifted, becoming part of the atmosphere they all worked within. And as the meeting continued, Lily contributed where she could, offering observations based on what she had seen and heard during the initial research phase, focusing on the people behind the data rather than just the numbers. And while some of her points were acknowledged, others were met with polite silence. And she recognized the pattern, not rejection, but reservation, a willingness to listen, but not yet to trust. And by the time the meeting ended, she felt the mental exhaustion that came not from the work itself, but from navigating the space between proving herself and staying true to the way she approached problems. And as she gathered her things, Daniel passed by her with a brief glance, not unkind, but not welcoming either, and said quietly that good intentions were not always enough in this environment, that results were what mattered. And Lily nodded, not disagreeing, because she knew he was not entirely wrong, but she also knew that how those results were achieved mattered just as much. And later that evening, as she prepared to leave the office, she received an update that shifted everything. The housing initiative they had been reviewing was facing an unexpected setback. A group of residents had rejected the proposed plan, citing concerns that had not been addressed in the initial assessments, and the timeline they were working with no longer allowed for delays, meaning the team would have to respond quickly or risk losing the entire project. And as the team regrouped, there was a noticeable increase in urgency, voices sharper, decisions faster, and Karen outlined the situation clearly, saying they needed a revised approach by the next morning, something that would not only resolve the concerns, but rebuild trust with the community. And as ideas began to surface, Lily listened closely, recognizing that many of the suggestions focused on adjusting logistics rather than addressing the underlying issue. And she felt that familiar instinct again, the same one that had guided her before. And after a moment she spoke, suggesting that instead of revising the plan from within the office, they should go directly to the residents that evening, meet them in person, listen without presenting solutions first, and understand what had been missed. And the room quieted slightly, the suggestion unexpected given the time and effort it would require. And Daniel responded quickly, pointing out the impracticality of organizing something like that on such short notice. But Karen did not dismiss the idea. Instead, she looked at Lily with a measured expression, considering the approach, and after a brief pause, she said that while it would be challenging, it might be necessary. And she asked Lily if she was willing to take the lead in organizing it. And for a split second, Lily felt the full weight of what that meant, not just contributing, but being responsible. And she nodded, accepting without hesitation. And as the team began to shift into action, she understood that this was more than a task. It was a test, not one that had been designed for her, but one that would reveal whether she truly belonged in the role she had stepped into. And as she moved quickly to coordinate the outreach, gathering contacts, and arranging a meeting with the residents, she could feel the energy around her changing, not yet supportive, but no longer dismissive, because in that moment, the question was no longer how she got there. It was whether she could deliver when it mattered most. The meeting with the residents did not happen in a conference room or under controlled conditions. It took place in a worn community hall just a few blocks from the housing complex, where the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead and rows of mismatched chairs filled quickly with people who carried not just frustration but exhaustion in their expressions. and Lily Monroe stood near the front with the team, aware that this environment was nothing like the polished floors and quiet offices they had come from. And before anyone could begin presenting, she stepped forward slightly and did something that shifted the entire tone of the room. She did not start with solutions. She started with a simple acknowledgement. She told them that they were there to listen first, not to convince. And for a moment the room remained guarded, but that single choice, that decision to step back instead of pushing forward, created just enough space for someone in the crowd to speak, and once one voice broke through, others followed. Concerns layered over one another, stories of previous plans that had promised change but delivered disruption, fears about being pushed out of homes they had lived in for years. And Lily listened, not interrupting, not redirecting, allowing the weight of their words to settle. And as the conversation unfolded, she began to see the pattern that had been missed in the earlier reports. It was not just about logistics or timelines. It was about trust that had been broken long before this project began. And when the voices finally quieted, she spoke again. This time, not with a prepared answer, but with something that connected what she had heard to what needed to happen next. She said that any plan moving forward had to be built with them, not for them, and that meant slowing down the process enough to include their input at every step, even if it complicated the timeline. And while not everyone agreed immediately, there was a noticeable shift in the room. Not acceptance yet, but a willingness to continue the conversation. And by the time the meeting ended, they had established a small working group of residents who agreed to collaborate directly with the team, a step that had not existed before. And as Lily stepped outside into the cool night air, she felt the exhaustion catch up with her. But beneath it, there was something else, a quiet sense that what she had suggested in the office had not just been an idea. It had worked, at least enough to move things forward. And the next morning, when the team reconvened, the atmosphere was different, not entirely changed, but adjusted. And Karen reviewed the outcome with clear acknowledgement of the progress that had been made, noting that the revised approach had reopened the project instead of allowing it to collapse. And while she did not single Lily out directly, there was no question about where that shift had come from. And Daniel, who had been most openly skeptical, remained quiet during the discussion, his expression thoughtful rather than critical. And as the meeting moved into planning the next steps, Lily contributed again, this time with more confidence. Not because the doubt had disappeared, but because she had already faced it once and moved through it. And as the day continued, she found that interactions with the team had begun to change in subtle ways. Questions directed toward her carried less edge. Responses to her ideas held more consideration. And while she knew that trust was still something to be earned over time, she also recognized that it had started to form, piece by piece, through action rather than explanation. And later that afternoon, she received a message asking her to come to Adrian Cole's office. And when she arrived, the space felt just as composed as before, the city stretching out beyond the windows. And Adrian stood near the desk, his attention shifting to her as she entered. And for a moment, there was no formal acknowledgement of the work she had done, no immediate praise. Just a quiet observation as he studied her expression, as if he were measuring something beyond the visible outcome. And then he spoke, saying that he had heard about the meeting and that not everyone would have chosen to listen first when time was limited. And Lily responded simply, saying that without understanding the problem, there was no solution that would last. And Adrian gave a small nod, not as approval, but as recognition. And then he said something that carried more weight than any formal evaluation. He said that results mattered, but how? Those results were achieved determined whether they could be sustained. And as the conversation settled, Lily realized that this moment was not just about the project or the progress they had made. It was about something deeper, the alignment between what she believed and what this role required. And for the first time since she had stepped into this world, she felt that those two things might not be in conflict after all, but connected in a way that could allow her to move forward without losing the part of herself that had brought her here in the first place. The days that followed did not slow down. They accelerated, each one bringing new challenges that tested not only Lily Monroe's ability to adapt, but her ability to hold onto the mindset that had brought her into this role in the first place. And the housing initiative became more than just a project. It became a turning point for how the team approached their work. because the involvement of the residents began to reshape decisions in ways that could not be predicted from a distance. And while progress was being made, it was not smooth. Disagreements surfaced, timelines shifted, and the pressure to deliver results within the company remained constant. And it was during one of these high-pressure moments that the tension that had been quietly building found its way back to the surface, because a senior executive outside of their team questioned the revised approach, arguing that the delays caused by community involvement were risking the financial viability of the project. And in a meeting that carried far more weight than the previous ones, the discussion became sharper, more direct, and Lily found herself in a position she had not anticipated, being asked to explain and defend a strategy in front of people who did not know her and had no reason to trust her judgment. And for a brief moment, the room felt different from any she had been in before, less about collaboration and more about justification. And she could feel the familiar pressure rise again, the awareness that her presence there is still not fully accepted, that one mistake could reinforce every doubt that had been quietly held against her. And as the executive outlined concerns about efficiency, cost, and risk, Lily listened carefully, not interrupting, allowing the full weight of the argument to be presented before she spoke. And when she did, her voice was steady, not confrontational but clear, as she explained that the original plan had already failed to gain approval from the community, which meant that without adjustment, the project would not move forward at all. And that while the revised approach required more time initially, it was building a foundation that would prevent future setbacks. And she emphasized that long-term success depended not just on execution, but on trust, something that could not be accelerated through pressure alone. And the room remained quiet as she finished. Not because there was agreement, but because there was consideration. And for a moment, it was unclear how her words would be received, until Adrian Cole, who had been observing without interruption, finally spoke, his voice calm, but carrying the authority that shifted the direction of the conversation instantly. And he said that the purpose of their work was not to push through plans that looked efficient on paper, but to create outcomes that were sustainable in reality, and that the revised strategy aligned with that goal. And with that, the tension eased, not completely, but enough to allow the discussion to move forward. And as the meeting concluded, Lily felt a subtle shift again, not just within the team, but within the broader environment she had stepped into, because this time, it was not just her actions that had been tested. It was her judgment, and it had held under pressure. And later that evening, as she walked out of the building, the city felt different, not because it had changed, but because she had, and the distance between where she had started and where she stood now became clearer in that moment, not as a measure of status, but as a measure of growth. And yet as she reached into her bag and felt the familiar shape of the charger, her thoughts returned to something simpler, the choice that had started everything. And she realized that the real challenge was not proving herself to others. It was continuing to make the same kind of choices in environments where the stakes were higher and the pressure to compromise was stronger. And as she stood there for a moment before heading toward the subway, she understood that the journey she had stepped into was not about a single opportunity. It was about the ongoing decision to act with the same integrity, even when it would be easier not to. And somewhere above the city lights, Adrian stood by the window of his office, watching the streets below, aware of the way the day had unfolded, not with surprise, but with quiet confirmation, because what he had seen in that small moment in the coffee shop was now being revealed in a much larger space. And he knew that the test he had set in motion was no longer about whether Lily belonged there. It was about how far she could go once she realized that she did. The project reached a point where progress could no longer be measured in meetings or internal approvals. It had to be seen in the real world. And on a cool Friday evening, a small gathering was held at the community site, not as a formal presentation, but as a shared moment between the team and the residents who had become part of the process, and Lily Monroe stood among them. Not at the front, not separate, but within the space that had once been filled with skepticism and hesitation, and now carried a cautious but growing sense of ownership. And as conversations moved around her, she listened, hearing not just concerns but suggestions, ideas that had come directly from the people who would live with the outcome. And it struck her how different this felt from the first meeting, how the energy had shifted from resistance to participation, not because everything had been resolved, but because people felt included in the path forward. And across the space, she noticed Daniel speaking with one of the residents. His posture less rigid than before, his tone more open, and when he glanced toward Lily, there was a brief nod. Not dramatic, but genuine, the kind of acknowledgement that did not need words. And she returned it quietly, understanding what it meant. Not full acceptance, but the beginning of it. And as the evening continued, Karen approached her, standing beside her with a look that carried both professionalism and something warmer beneath it. And she said that the way Lily had handled the project had changed more than just the outcome. It had shifted how the team approached similar challenges, and Lily listened, taking in the words carefully because they mattered, not as validation alone, but as confirmation that the approach she believed in could hold up under pressure. And for a moment she allowed herself to feel that, not as pride, but as recognition of the distance she had traveled in such a short time. And later, as the event began to wind down, she stepped outside for a moment, the air cool against her skin, the sounds of conversation fading slightly behind her as she looked out at the street. The same kind of street she had walked countless times before, only now it felt different, not because of where she was standing, but because of what she had carried with her into that space. And she reached in her bag, her fingers finding the charger again, the small object that had become something far greater than its purpose. And as she held it, she heard footsteps behind her, measured and familiar, and she did not need to turn immediately to know who it was. And when she did, Adrian Cole was standing a few steps away, his expression calm but thoughtful, as if he had been observing the evening not just as a leader, but as someone looking for something deeper. And he said that what she had done there was not easy, that most people would have chosen the faster path, the one that looked efficient from the outside, and Lily responded quietly that it would not have worked, not in a way that lasted. And Adrian nodded slightly, acknowledging the truth in that. And for a moment they stood in a silence that was not uncomfortable, just full, as if both of them understood that this was not just about a project or a result, but about a principle that had been tested and proven in a real environment. And then Adrian reached into his pocket and took out something small, holding it for a second before extending it toward her. And when she looked, she saw that it was not new, not something expensive or symbolic in a usual sense, but a simple protective case for the charger, clear and understated. And he said that sometimes the smallest things carry the most meaning, and that it was worth protecting them. And Lily looked at it, then back at him, understanding that this was not just about the object, it was about what it represented, the choice she had made, the reason she was there, and the reminder that even as everything around her grew more complex, that core part of her could not be lost. And she accepted it with a small nod, not needing to say more because the moment spoke for itself. And as they stood there under the soft glow of the streetlights, she realized that whatever had started as an unexpected opportunity had become something much more intentional, something built not on chance, but on a series of choices that continued to define where it would lead. And for the first time, she allowed herself to fully see it, not as something she had been given, but as something she had stepped into and shaped through who she chose to be. In the weeks that followed, the project did not just move forward. It transformed into something that people pointed to as an example of what could happen when decisions were made with intention rather than urgency. And the housing initiative that had once been at risk of collapse became a model that other teams within the company began to study. Not because it was perfect, but because it worked in a way that lasted. And Lily Monroe found herself no longer navigating the edges of the team, but standing within it. Her presence no longer questioned in the same way. Her voice carrying weight not because it had been given authority, but because it had earned it through consistency. And even Daniel, who had once challenged her place there, approached her one afternoon with a straightforward acknowledgement, saying that he had misjudged her approach at the beginning and that the outcome had proven him wrong. And Lily accepted it with a small nod, not needing more, because the work itself had already spoken. And as time continued, the responsibilities she carried grew, not in a way that overwhelmed her, but in a way that reflected trust. And each decision she made reinforced the understanding that she had stepped into something that required not just skill but clarity of values. And one evening, as the city lights began to glow and the office gradually emptied, Lily remained at her desk reviewing notes from a new project when she received a message asking her to come upstairs. And when she entered Adrian Cole's office, the space felt familiar now, no longer distant or intimidating, and Adrian stood by the window as he had many times before. But when he turned to face her, there was a shift in his expression, something less observational and more direct. And he told her that the board had approved the expansion of the community division and that he wanted her to lead a new initiative that would bring the same approach to multiple cities. And for a moment, Lily was still, not because she doubted herself, but because she understood what that meant, the scale, the responsibility, the impact, and she asked him why her, even now, after everything, and Adrian's answer was simple. He said that he had not been looking for someone with the most experience. He had been looking for someone who would make the right choice when it mattered, and that she had proven that more than once. And the words settled between them, not as praise, but as a statement of fact. And Lily felt something shift again, not uncertainty, but acceptance, because this time the opportunity did not feel unexpected. It felt aligned with everything she had done to reach that point. And she said yes, not as a leap into the unknown, but as a continuation of a path she had already begun. And as the conversation came to a close, Adrian stepped closer, his voice quieter now, and he said that there was one more thing. And he reached into his desk and placed something in front of her, a small framed card. And when she looked closer, she saw that it held a simple image of the charger, photographed on the day she had given it away, accompanied by a single line of text that read that real power is shown when no one is watching. And Lily looked at it for a moment, the memory of that day clear in her mind, the uncertainty, the cost, the choice. And when she looked back up at Adrian, there was a quiet understanding between them that did not need explanation. Because what had begun as a moment between two strangers had become something far greater, something built on actions rather than appearances. And as she left the office that night, stepping out into the city that had once felt overwhelming and uncertain, she carried that understanding with her, not as a reminder of where she had been, but as a foundation for where she was going. And in that moment, the story that had started with a dying phone and a simple act of kindness reached its true conclusion, not in the form of a single reward or a final destination, but in the clarity of knowing that the choices she made when it mattered most had not only changed her life, they had defined it.